Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight. Former Federal Labor Party leader Mark Latham, Queensland Green Senator Larissa Waters, the leader of the Palmer United Party, Clive Palmer, is still waiting to see if he'll take a seat in Parliament. Playwright David Williamson, whose latest play dramatises the life of Rupert Murdoch. Social researcher and director of the Mind and Mood Report, Rebecca Huntley, and the re-elected independent senator for South Australia, Nick Xenophon. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. And as usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation with the Quanda hashtag on your screen. And our first question tonight comes from Bridget Meaney.
There are mutterings of reform in how the Australian Senate is elected because of the possible induction of colourful new senators. Is an ordinary Australian citizen with real-life experience outmanoeuvring the larger, money-backed parties such a negative idea? Or does the current process take the Australian ethos of fair go to dangerous new heights where incompetent, unqualified and indeed questionable individuals are gaining seats by mere accident?
Rebecca Huntley, let's start with you.
I don't think the independents have the monopoly on incompetent politicians, to tell you the truth. I think if you were really an incompetent politician, the best thing to do would be to join the Labor and Liberal Party and kind of work your way up through those kind of processes. But I'm not an expert on Senate reform. I do think that what's very clear from the way that Australians talk about politics is they really want to see the diversity of the community reflected in the parliament. And in many ways, the Parliament doesn't reflect the diversity of the community. And we've only got to see that in terms of the government's front bench announced today as well. So I think that, but I think I'd be interested to know what Clive Palmer's view is about the colourful figures in the Senate and any kind of changes that might be made in relation to that.
We'll come to Clive in a minute. I want to hear from Nick Xenophon first. So does a system that delivers ordinary folk into the Senate require reforming?
Tony, I really don't like some of the elitism in terms of what we've heard about Ricky Muir, the motoring enthusiast, saying that he's unemployed father of five, and I find that really quite disdainful of him. I think it's quite unfair. But I think it is fair to say that the system we have, the voting system, this above-the-line system where you give the power to the parties, the major parties and the micro parties, to control where your preferences go, because 95% of people vote above the line, is a broken system. It's a system subject to grubby preference deals, not just with the micro parties and preference harvesting, but with the major parties. I'm still cranky that the ALP is preferencing the Liberals ahead of my running mate, who's from the political centre, who would have got in but for that. And I think the system is broken. I'm still cranky with the Greens about preferencing the climate sceptics ahead of my running mate, who happens to believe in climate change. So not blaming Larissa for that, but the system is broken. The way to fix it, I think, is to have an optional preferential system below the line. That way you bust up the business models of the preference harvesters and all those grubby backroom deals. That way, 1 to 6 at least, below the line, your vote's valid, that's it. And that way you destroy the backroom deals of the major, minor and micro parties.
David Williamson, what do you think about a system that has delivered this array of colourful, interesting and indeed some quite ordinary people into the Senate?
Yes, well, again, like Nick, I don't want to appear elitist, but the kangaroo poo throwing chap did worry me a little bit. I mean...
Really, why is that?
There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, yeah, well...
I've thrown kangaroo poo in my time, Dave.
Yeah, well...
Tonight, Clive?
Yeah. Well, I've obviously got to widen my experience a little bit.
Or wear gloves.
Or wear gloves, yeah.
Clive.
Well, first of all, Nick's a great senator for Australia, and we preferenced him first in Tasmania, but we preferenced his second candidate down the ticket. And why we did that was because we think Nick's changed. When he was first elected as a senator, he got 2.8% of the vote. So if we had a system where...
No, it's not right. In the Legislative Council.
Legislative Council, that's right.
I was elected as a senator with a full quota.
Yeah, OK, but that's what you're on your primary vote. So we're talking about... So what I'm saying is that we need to have people that are diverse, and democracy really is about choice, about different ideas. And if the electors are so incompetent to pick the wrong people, it's the electors we've got to educate, not the candidates, and limit people's rights.
Now, the questioner asked about larger money-backed parties, but what about smaller money-backed parties?
Well, money's good anyway, Tony. You know? we've got legislation that says you can't discriminate against people based on sex and other things, and why not on money? You know, why should I be discriminated against?
I'm just saying your story is not exactly Mr. Smith goes to Washington, is it? It's not exactly the ordinary fellow who ends up in Parliament.
Well, we had a two-party system where the media, people like yourselves, just had Rudd and Abbott, and that was all it was. So we had to get our ideas out in the public, and we used our money to get our ideas in the public in the last week, and we got a response. But if those ideas had been bad ideas, no one would have voted for them anyway, because you can spend as much money as you want, but if you haven't got the right ideas that appeal to people, they won't vote for you. So what's wrong with people having more diversity and having more alternatives in this country? We all come from many nations of the world, and we're a multi-ethnic country, and we should have multi-ideas. Elections should be about the battle of ideas. Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott were so boring. The highlight of the campaign was when Tony Abbott said, "Shut up, Kevin." Now that's supposed to be a policy for Australia. I like that guy because he said, "Shut up." You know.
All right.
Surely
Well, shut up, Clive, and we'll go to Larissa. Sorry to be rude. Since you like it so much, I thought you wouldn't mind.
Touche,
Larissa.
Tony. Oh, look, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said tonight. Clearly, the Parliament should be more representative, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of cultural background. But I think when you see some pretty perverse outcomes, like a fellow in WA getting elected off 0.2% of the vote, I don't think that's giving the voters' intention a real representation. So I'm really pleased that Nick's come on board with the bill that Bob Brown put before the Senate in the last Parliament that says actually we should make sure the voters know where their vote is going. They should be the ones always to decide their preferences in the Senate. So we'd like to see reform of that Senate voting system to make it easier for voters to make their intention clear, rather than parties.
Okay, Mark Latham, are we off to a good start here? We get an array of interesting characters in the Senate and immediately start talking about reforming the system.
Well, there is an attempt by the major parties and some of the existing interests to try and freeze these new people out. But I'm interested in the description of them, apparently a negative description, that they're ordinary. Who among the major party senators could be described as extraordinary in the past Parliament? Probably only Penny Wong and Bob Carr. I mean, the Liberal Party put up Mary Jo Fisher in South Australia, who was done for hocking down the local supermarket. I'd much prefer Who Flung Dung Man to someone knocking off the gear down the supermarket. And years ago, Labor, of course, had Mal Colston there, preserved for several decades, who was a world-class rorter. So the major parties have got people who've been exceptionally ordinary, if you look at it in those terms. And I think the diversity of people coming in, I'm not a rev head myself. I quite dislike the noise and smell of the sport, but there's a lot of motoring enthusiasts out there, and if they feel they want a representative in the Senate, then in an open democracy they should have one, and that's what they voted for. Nick's proposal, I think, for simplifying the system or giving the option of optional preferential under the line, I think is a sensible reform, but let's not be elitist about the newcomers and judge them before they've even taken their place.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. It's from Kaylee Cross.
My question is for Clive Palmer.
Oh, well, I wake up.
Get used to it, Clive. Get used to it.
You recently accused the Australian Electoral Commission of corruption, alleging that they rigged the seat of Fairfax. This being the reason that your lead continues to shrink. How do you think this impacts upon the integrity of the AEC and the credibility of every other seat of Australia?
Well, I think they are rorting the system. If you go to this polling booth at Coolum Beach, you'll see there's 768 votes cast for the House of Representatives, more than there is for the Senate. So what happened of the 3,000 voters? Only 2,000 voted for the Senate, and there was another 700 votes for the House of Representatives. How did those 700 votes get there if they didn't vote for the Senate at the same time? That's a real question, and that's on the AEC website. And I think we've got a real issue with that. And one of the things I'm concerned about in Australia is that all our divisional returning officers are ex-military officers of the Australian Armed Forces. In my seat in Fisher, it's an ex-military officer who's the divisional returning officer, sorry, Fairfax.
So what's the problem with that, by the way?
Well, I think the military, as a sense, shouldn't be involved in democracy. We've seen what's happened in Egypt, for example.
These are former military.
Oh, come on.
Very crazy.
Clive, is this like
countdown.
Greenpeace? Is this like Greenpeace being funded by the CIA and Wendy Deng being a Chinese spy? Is this in the same category? Come on.
No, it's not.
It's really very offensive that you're accusing them. You're actually imputing that they are corrupt.
Let's see what happens. how can you have 760 more votes for the House of Representatives than you've got for the Senate in the same booth? You've all voted. You get 2 forms.
If
Well, how
you
can
win, will you pursue the AEC?
Yeah, of course I will. And,
you win.
and I've raised these questions while I'm still leading. I've raised them a week ago. But I'm just saying mathematically, there's 768 votes more in the House of Representatives box than there is in the Senate box for one of our polls. How did those votes get there? There are not many other polls like that. And that's a real question.
But you talked also about, if I can just pick you up on this, pre-poll voting, and of course what the major parties do, and I doubt whether you did, was to get out in that phase and campaign very hard for people who are casting their votes early. Now that's one of the reasons why extra votes are coming in late, because these people, these people put their votes in, their ballots in early, and now they're being counted late.
No, well, that's not true, because we were polling. But what I'm saying is there's a polling booth, there's 2 boxes, there's a Senate box and there's a House of Representative box. Doesn't matter how people are voting. I'm not talking how they voted. I'm saying the total number of ballots in the Senate box was 760 less than the total number of ballots in the House Representative box. And that indicates that there's been some interference in that House Representative box, not in the Senate.
So, just briefly, have you got any evidence, any actual evidence of fraud or vote tampering or any of the things that you're saying should be used to prove there needs to be another election in Fairfax, which you were calling for today?
Let's go through the voting system, Tony, if you've got the time. And that is that, first of all, they authorise your ballot. You then go and vote on a seat and use a pencil, which can be rubbed out. You don't use ink, right? You don't have to give any identification on who you are when you vote. It's not marked up on a computer for the other booths. It's just crossed out in the line. And then we've got a situation where we had 100 ballots that had no authorisation as being validly issued. And we asked the AEC to inspect the initials of the person who authorised the ballots, and they wouldn't let us do it. So there's no integrity in that system. And we need to have some integrity. We live in a computer age today. How can you vote in Australia if you can't even show your identification when you vote? I mean, how hopeless is that?
Let's move on. Larissa Waters, are you, have you seen any evidence in Queensland of widespread fraud in the voting system?
No, look, I haven't, and I am quite alarmed at the allegations that Clive makes, and I certainly hope he has some evidence, but...
Well, the court agreed with us today.
Well, I mean, you also accused us of being puppets of the CIA, which is frankly laughable, so... you know,
is that right?
I'm sure there'll be... Yeah, no, not so much. Look, I think we should be proud of the democratic system that we've got. I think the AEC does an excellent job. I would be flabbergasted if there was any actual basis for these allegations. So I hope you understand the seriousness of your allegations.
Maybe he's onto something, Tony. I might have won in 04. I'm going home tonight and getting a spreadsheet to look at reps votes versus Senate votes in every polling booth. That rotten scoundrel Howard might have rorted the whole bloody election and done me out of my entitlement. Yeah. I ran 5 times in the reps and thought the AEC was professional, independent, and you never stop to think that it could be anything but that. So I've had a different experience. But in 04, there could have been something going on. I'm going to take...
Is there anyone on this side who wants to jump in on this? Nick Xenophon.
I've already said, you know, is Wendy being a Chinese spy? Well,
of course, that's what they allege in the United States and the Wall Street Journal, Nick. I've only gone that result.
But tell me, that's what honestly, do you honestly believe that? I don't understand the connection, because if somebody happened to serve their country in the military and they work for the AEC, they should be disqualified from doing that.
I think our AEC officers should represent the community. We don't want a whole class of one people that have got links together. And what I'm saying not is that one person's in the military. I'm saying there's multiple people who have served in the military as officers in this role.
You're basically smearing.
I'm just going to interrupt both of you. Sorry, we've got a question from the floor. I'm just going to go to that one.
Clive made a point earlier. Why are we in 2013 still using pencils? And in America, they at least have a computer system, and other countries. What is the go with the pencil and the paper?
You rub it out.
Yeah, so I'm concerned in 2013 we're not using the technology to make it safe to give an accurate account.
I think there's one thing to say that we could improve it by using technology. It's another thing to say that there's a military conspiracy through the Australian Electoral Commission, probably with Wendy Deng.
You're not focusing on the issue. The issue is you don't have to show your ID when you vote. As simple as that. You have to show your ID when you go on an aeroplane. You have to show your ID when you go into a country. But when you vote in this country, you can come and vote 10, 20, 30 times if you like.
I'd just be interested to know, because we've got a number of people in politics on the panel here, how do you feel when you're standing that people are still using a pencil in 2013 rather than maybe a PIN code that was emailed to you or posted to you?
All right, we'll get a brief comment from Nick Xenophon on that. I mean, it is a bit outdated, isn't it?
It is outdated, and that's one thing to look at that, because I still have fundamental confidence in the integrity and the decency of the AEC. I think Clive's just simply gone too far, alleging a conspiracy theory. If we're going to review the electoral system, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of can we improve it, can we use technology, as Rebecca suggested, but to just say military people plus AEC equals conspiracy is just going too far.
Yeah, David.
Clive, I wish you'd told me about Wendy Ding being a spy before I'd done the last draft of Rupert. I mean, I could have made it a really good ending.
Well, if you'd done your research properly, David, you would have found it.
I'll just make the point that you have told several journalists to go and Google it, and naturally...
Have you Googled it?
Naturally, some of us did. And in fact, the only real evidence of this, or only real reporting of this, comes from a Chinese blog. And it does indeed make these allegations. That is true, but that's the main source, a Chinese blog. It's hardly the most reliable source in the world. Well,
it gives a lot of sources for its information. And of course, if you've been recruited in Guangzhou to be a spy, who do you think would know about it more, the Chinese or the Americans, all right? And that's the reality of it. But anyway, Rupert's been very kind to me since I made that allegation. He doesn't seem to want to infuriate me anymore. So, you know, God bless Rupert, you know?
Oh, he hasn't sued me yet.
He hasn't. Well, you know, he's a wonderful apparatchik.
He has got his own issues with Wendy Deng, by the way.
If you get into Parliament, what are you going to do with parliamentary privilege? This is the thing that terrifies me. This is what you're saying on national television. What are you going to do in the Parliament with parliamentary privilege?
Well, the truth will set you free, and Australia's been...
Clive, there is a sense, and I'll just pick up that point, there is a sense that from time to time you're a little loose with the truth. And the question is, if you actually have parliamentary privilege, will you be looser? Because you won't be able to be sued for things you say in Parliament.
I'll confess tonight that I don't mind if people sue me. I'm not really worried if people sue me. But I do think I don't want to compromise my beliefs just to please a journalist or to have a different position. What I've said tonight is I think it's a bad system, our voting system, because you don't have to show your ID to vote. You have ballots which are marked with a pencil. There's no computer system on booth saying when you voted. And I think that all those things are wrong. OK, all right, let's move on. Our next question comes from Alexander Lau.
Tony Abbott seems to believe that he has a mandate in both houses and that the Labor Party should vote in Parliament according to his purported mandate. Does the coalition understand that the Labor, Greens, Independents and other minor party representatives and senators hold the trust and interests of their constituents and are not serving purely in the interests of the current government? Mr Xenophon, Ms Waters and Mr Palmer, will you remain steadfast in your beliefs and the beliefs of your electorate rather than bending to the will of the Liberal Party?
Let's start with Nick Xenophon.
People vote differently in the Senate because they actually want to have checks and balances, and our constitutional forefathers actually had a system designed so that the Senate could block any legislation, and it's half-cent elections, the votes are staggered, and there is a mechanism, if there is a deadlock, to have a double dissolution election, which I don't think will happen. But I think just as the government has a mandate to introduce legislation, the Senate has, I think, a bigger mandate to carefully review legislation, to scrutinise it, and that's the role. I didn't vote for the carbon tax because there was a reverse mandate of the Gillard government not to introduce one, and they did. But when we replace the carbon tax, I want it to be replaced with something that's effective in environmental terms and economic terms as well. And I'm not quite sure that the direct action proposal is going to do that. OK, so briefly, Nick Xenophon, does that mean you won't be giving your vote to a coalition bill to scrap the carbon tax? Because they're going to separate it out into bills. Well, I'll be putting up a whole range of amendments because I think that both major parties have the same goal, and that is a 5% reduction on greenhouse gases by 2020 on 2000 levels. How do you best achieve that? That's the public policy debate we need to have. OK, but you're not going to vote to remove a price on carbon. Well, the coalition is coming up with a direct action plan. I think it needs to be modified to be much more effective. Rebecca Huntley, just to bring you back to the original question.
In terms of mandate?
Yes.
I think whenever I hear about a government, Labor or Liberal, talking about we've got a mandate to do whatever we want, it doesn't feel very genuine to me. It's basically we won the election, so we want everybody to kind of lay down. It doesn't work that way. In the end, you know, he's exactly right. In terms of what she said, individual people living in certain electorates want their member to see what's the best thing for them. So I just find that mandate talk very frustrating.
David, do you have a view on this mandate question?
Yeah, no, I agree with the questioner, or his implied direction that everybody should stick to their beliefs and not be bullied into voting for something they don't believe in.
Mark Latham.
Well, I think it's absurd for the coalition to argue this because in 2007 Labor had an election victory to introduce an ETS and the coalition voted against that in denial of what they now say was a mandate. But I think the bigger point for Australia is I'm sure 50 years from now we'll look back with a sense of absurdity that Australia elected its first ever climate change sceptic as Prime Minister in the time we've had the debate about climate change because there is no effective coalition policy for dealing with this looming climate and environmental disruption. The direct action policy is discredited and in fact Labor senators and members could argue that in supporting carbon pricing they're actually doing the very best thing to help the coalition achieve the goal that Nick mentioned earlier on their stated objective in reducing carbon emissions. So it's almost like Labor needs to save that coalition promise from the disaster of direct action and the general scepticism and denialism you get in the coalition benches. They're on the wrong side of history and eventually that'll be proven.
Clive Palmer, I think it's fair to say you're a... no, I'll come to Larissa in a moment. But I think it's fair to say you're a climate change sceptic yourself. I mean, do you think Tony Abbott has a mandate?
Well, I'm just terrified that someone's going to bully me, Tony, or bully me or my senators. I live in fear every day of Tony Abbott being a bully and standing over with me, and I've got visions at night when I go to sleep that I can't really come to terms with, that I'll have to deal with these bullies, and I'd be the first person to kowtow in the Senate. You know, I would go down on my back and worship them. So I'm frightened about that, you know. So I don't know how, but I'm not a senator, I'm not even in Parliament, but I don't think our senators will be bullied.
Well, we've actually got a question on that. We'll quickly go to Greg Vanes and then I'll come back to Larissa.
Port Larissa.
This question's for Clive Palmer. One of your soon-to-be-elected Palmer United Party representatives from Tasmania, Jackie Lambie, seems to support the carbon tax or some form of it, even though your party's policy is to abolish it. Will you allow your elected senators to vote according to their conscience, or will you require them to toe your party's policy line?
Well, to clarify that, talking to Jackie Lambie on the weekend, she was a little bit confused in the interview and it probably wasn't reported to reflect what she was talking about. She thought it was about talking about our ethanol policy, which is to produce ethanol for our fuel, rather than actually the carbon tax. So that was misreported, I think.
So going back to the point, though, if she or your other senator were to say, I want to vote differently to your opinions on this, would you allow them to do it?
Well, our position will be exactly the same as Tony Abbott's relationship is with his senators, and we'll follow his lead.
Yeah, but
our relationship will be the same as who's the Labor leader. We don't know, whoever he is, whatever his relationship.
Well, they're about to have an election. You want another one in Fairfax? They're having one as well.
Well, Tony Abbott has promised us a double dissolution if it's a hung parliament. Where's the double dissolution?
Well, I think he's going to wait.
Is that an election promise?
Presumably he'll wait and see what happens when all your senators...
We'd like to double our senators.
When all the new senators come in. No, but very briefly, so you plan to wave through the scrapping of the carbon tax, your senators anyway?
Well, I think our policy was that we should scrap the carbon tax from the day it was introduced and refund the money to people who have paid higher electricity prices. The coalition policy is that they should scrap the carbon tax when they get elected. So there's a difference there, and we'd have to discuss that with them.
Larissa Waters.
Thanks, Tony. Just on that last point, householders were actually given compensation more than they outlaid on the carbon price, so there'd certainly be no refunds to be given to households because they've already got that. And to your question, Alexander, absolutely the Greens will stand firm on the carbon price in the Senate. This is a crucial issue. This is a world-changing issue, and I think the last Parliament did so well to finally take those first steps to deal with climate change, long overdue, and right when the science is saying we've got to get on with reducing emissions seriously if we are to have any any hope of constraining warming to 2 degrees, we've now got a Prime Minister-elect who says climate change is crap and whose own policy doesn't have any support from any economist or any scientist in the world. I'm just going to ignore whatever he's doing next to me. I was saying, thank you, Clive, for your probably entertaining antics on my left. I suppose we'll have to get used to that, won't we?
How could you say the last parliament was successful in anything? I don't know, you know.
Well, if you just let me finish, Clive. The point is the 5% target, which unfortunately the direct action policy apparently won't be able to achieve, according to all of the scientists and the economists. Tony Abbott now says he won't even fully fund that policy to reach the 5% target. So we don't even have a 5% target of reductions on 2000 levels, which was always a pitifully inadequate target if we're seriously to protect the Great Barrier Reef, our economy, our very way of life, all of the things that we rely on with a healthy climate. So we've just got to retain strong climate laws, and we will fight for that in the Senate.
OK, we've got a hand thrown up in the front row there. Quickly go to you. Hopefully a brief question or comment.
Yeah, I just have one question. Why are we operating as a company when under our federation we're a constitution? Or we're a federation under our constitution, sorry. Why are we operating as a corporation when under our constitution we're a federation?
All right, I think I'm going to take that as a comment, and I'm going to move to our next question, which is from Emmanuel Macready's.
Julie Gillard wrote in her essay published in The Guardian online that the new rules for electing Labor Party leaders, pushed through caucus by Kevin Rudd after he replaced her, are a clumsy attempt to hold power. She stated that these rules protect an unsupported, poorly performing incumbent rather than ensuring that the best person gets chosen and supported for the best reasons. Mr. Latham, do you think the Labor Party leadership is now compromised by these changes? And do you feel that Kevin Rudd acted in his own best interests rather than that of the party?
Well, I think Kevin might have been an accidental reformer, but the reform needed to be made because if you read Julia Gillard's otherwise excellent essay, she's very critical of the culture, the subterranean activities inside the Labor caucus that's produced the record level of leadership instability. I mean, the most absurd thing we've heard so far is Graham Richardson and Stephen Conroy saying, oh, these new rules are no good, they're chaotic. Have they been watching the Labor leadership for the past decade? We're now on the 6th change in the last 10 years. And the public's onto it. You talk to people in the street about politics, it's all about the instability of Labor leadership, faceless men, sub-factional people, all these malignant influences. So the time has come where Labor needs a rule change to provide a bit of stability. So a leader can go forward to the Australian people without that person being seen as on probation at the whim of faceless men, factional warlords and union bosses. So the change needed to be made. And I think the curious thing about the Gillard essay was she was very critical of the culture and recognised the need for change. She didn't put up her own proposal. Perhaps it was a case of saying, oh, well, Kevin did it, it can't be much chop. Well, I think you need to recognise that whatever his motivations, it's a change that needs to be made because it takes 50% of the power away from the sub-factional warlords and gives it to the branch members. It makes it so much harder to have these coup d'etats in the middle of the night. So it's an act of stability, and for that reason it should be supported.
So do you think Julia Gillard got this wrong? Because there are obviously a few different types of views of her essay, one that it was sort of self-serving and a specific attack on Kevin Rudd's motivations for doing this. The other is that she really was articulately venting an opposed position.
Well, she didn't articulate what that position might be. And if you're going to criticise the rule change, you need an alternative. I thought her essay was outstanding in many respects. She's belled the cat on the thing that left and right don't really recognise, that is that Tony Abbott, other than on a couple of taxation measures, campaigned as Gillard Light, essentially banking Labor's economic and social policy strategies and just trying to, at the margin, make a point of difference on a couple of taxation issues. So her essay overall was outstanding, but when I got to the end of it, it was curious that she was critical of the culture. She knows how corrosive this has been. For 3 years, they made her life a hell. She had no chance of being an effective parliamentary and national leader because of the non-stop white-handing. You need to get rid of that. The Labor Party just can't go on with this structural problem where in a caucus of about 85 members, 25 of them are sub-factional warlords who think they want to make the decision for everyone else. You couldn't run a TV show this way. We've got you and Clive in charge, Tony. We haven't got 25 people in charge trying to run it for everyone else. You can't run a business, a community group that way. Labor has the most dysfunctional culture and structure you can imagine in the federal caucus. So this rule change is the first of many steps that are needed to fix that basic problem.
So just briefly, before I go on to the others, will this open sort of new election of the leaders work with only 2 candidates, both of whom you've criticised as being members of those sub-factions?
Well, I would hope there'd be a bigger choice, and in the future there might be if the role of the sub-factional system is diluted. There was a time, say in 1967, where 5 ran for the parliamentary leadership, a much more open contest where people who had legitimate ambitions put their hand up. Now you need to get the nod from your sub-factional grouping and other warlords to be a viable candidate to run in the first place. So if you make other changes, such as a community pre-selection system, so that people are beholden to their communities instead of the sub-factional bosses, if you dilute the union influence at party conferences, if you went to 100% vote for the leadership by party members, if you allowed that elected leader to pick the front bench instead of the system they've gone back to, a very chaotic system of allowing the sub-factions to pick the front bench, all of that bundle of reforms would fundamentally change the nature of the Labor Party, and you would have many more people who feel like, as you should in a parliamentary system, they've got rights they can express, nominate for leadership, and not be bound by this medieval system.
David Williamson, what did you think of the Gillard essay, and what do you think about the arguments that she made against these new changes and reforms to how Labor leaders are elected and how they're gotten rid of?
Well, I agree with Mark that it may be an accidental good thing that Ruddy did, because it does bring the branch membership in and gives them a function, gives them a reason for belonging to the Labor Party. But I think all the navel-gazing about the ins and outs of factions and that ignores the fact that the Labor Party really has to find a direction to go in, to stand for something, and they didn't at this election. And I think the obvious thing that they need to stand for is the fact that Australia is becoming one of the more unequal countries in the world in terms of the Gini index, which measures inequality. They are way out. Australia, US and UK are very unfair societies, and Labor is supposed to be standing up for fairness, but they run a mile. The Murdoch press only has to say class warfare or what's their other term? I forget, but anyway, they only have to scare the Labor Party like that, and they push them away from what should be being done, and that's a radical
wedge politics.
Yeah.
Wedge politics, yeah.
Wedge, no, it's not that. At any rate, I'll find it. It'll come to me. Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to be rude to Clive. How could you be? But the rich are doing very well in the English-speaking free market economies, which Rupert loves. They're doing extremely well, and the rest of the population are not doing extremely well, because the model is shove down the wages as far as you can, which ignores the fact that if the so-called workplace flexibility, which means shove down the wages, happens, then you get a lot of people who have no money, can't buy the stuff, the economy suffers, whereas the Scandinavian countries and Germany have not tried to beat down their workforce. They have paid them decently, and their economies are functioning much better.
We should make the point that Tony Abbott says he's got no intention of changing in a dramatic way the Workplace Act. So, Rebecca Huntley.
I think it's a bit rich to say that Julia Gillard shouldn't have a role to play in what the Labor Party should be doing. I mean, I think she behaved impeccably during the campaign. She could have done all kinds of things. She could have thrown grenades, and she didn't. I think that her Guardian piece, I agree with Mark, it was excellent. I understand why she attacked the issue about the ballot for the leader, because it's pure Kevin wanting to deal with the only thing that really matters to Kevin, which is about being leader. But at the very least, it's a step towards internal democracy. If I was to choose the one thing that the Labor Party could do, it was actually how they could improve the nature of what it is to be a Labor Party member. I was a party member for 10 years and I just couldn't stand the drafty halls and long branch meetings. You know what they're like, Mark. And if that's all that it means to be a member of the Labor Party, then that's just not enough. So at least giving people a say about the leader is important. And given the fact that the Australian population is thoroughly sick of politics, this is the time for the Labor Party to experiment and think about how do we get this internal democracy right and how do we really give value to what it is about being a Labor Party member.
But they've got to think about what they want to do with it.
That's another question.
It's a bigger question. I think it's a much bigger question, and they've got to be prepared. Yeah, it's the politics of envy is the other thing. The Murdoch press only has to say the politics of envy. The rich in all the English-speaking countries should be paying a lot more tax than they are. No one's going to do it. It's as if the Labor Party has lost its fairness platform. It's lost its zeal for reform. It just cringes at anything that is said to.
Okay, all right. Let's hear from a few other panellists. Nick Xenophon.
I don't have that problem in my party room.
Yeah.
It's kind of fairly easily done.
Looking at it from the outside, do you think
I think it's a good idea. I think it's
Labor?
going to be a bit messy initially, but ultimately I think it's going to be good for the Labor Party, and I think that the Libs might learn a few things from it. And let's bear in mind that in the UK, the Conservative Party and the Labor Party go out to their members for the leadership, and sometimes it takes many weeks, and they manage to cope with it. I think it's a healthy thing.
Larissa Waters of the Greens going to learn from this that maybe it's a good idea to have an election for your leader.
Well, look, just firstly, I think clearly Labor has quite a lot of rebuilding to do, and I think the revolving door that was the leadership has contributed to a sense of public malaise, and as Rebecca said, people are fed up with politics. But I tend to agree with David. I think the more fundamental problem, rather than simply choosing the leader, and wouldn't it be nice if there were some women in there too? I'd love to see Penny Wong or Tony Plibersek put their hand up, but that's up to Labor. But the more important point is, why did we have an election where there was so little difference between the two big parties, when Labor and Liberal were in a race to the bottom on refugees, when Labor was championing the fact that they had abolished the carbon tax?
Okay, but right now we're actually talking about the democracy experiment that Labor's about to embrace. And I'll just ask you a simple question. Should the Greens also embrace it when they look to choose a new leader, because you don't have grassroots democracy?
Well, we do actually. All of our members vote for all of our candidates, so our people get a direct say in electing their candidates. So the membership certainly have their voice. But you're correct in that the party room selects the leader after every election. And certainly if the party wants to move for such a reform, then you know, we'll have that debate. People haven't expressed that feeling yet, because I think the membership feels very well listened to in the Greens. They have a very large role to play. So I think we're perhaps in a different kettle of fish there.
So, Clive Palmer, what is your party? A benign dictatorship?
What I'm trying to say is the idea of Parliament is that the Prime Minister has the confidence of the House and he remains the Prime Minister of the House. The situation in this system is that you could be the Labor leader and only have the support of one member of your party, so you wouldn't have the confidence of the House. No one thinks about Parliament. They talk about Labor and Liberal, but these parliamentarians are representatives of the community, and they are the ones that should be deciding, because they're accountable to the voters. We don't want to have Parliament accountable to members of a political party. They need to be accountable to the whole community. The whole parliamentary system is set up so the Prime Minister, whoever it is, will have the confidence of the House. Under the Labor rort, he may only have one or two Labor members supporting him, but the support of all the members, and he would be the leader of the country. How undemocratic is that?
Well, I'll just get Mark Latham to respond to that. I mean...
Well, it's a ridiculous notion. I mentioned that 1967 ballot when Gough Whitlam won a minority of primary votes against the four other candidates. So you could have said at that stage in the Parliamentary Labor Party, a majority of the caucus members wanted someone other than Whitlam to be their leader. In broad ballots, with a preferential system, you get those outcomes. But the whole principle of Labor politics, supposedly, this is the original notion, is solidarity, that once the caucus makes the decision, they bind around the leader, and the leader then commands in government the majority on the floor of the House of Representatives. The breakdown in the system has been the revolving door, the factional bosses wanting to run the whole show, and if they can't get a compliant leader, they'll white ant and find someone who is more compliant, who listens to them and supposedly acts on their directives. So that's the whole structural malaise that federal Labor has got itself into. And you need to fix that so you can then enforce some of these basic principles of solidarity and be a respectable, credible political force into the future. The problem for Labor is in opposition it can get worse. You've got nothing to lose. And people sort of at the moment, it's a bit like the Hare Krishna. They're running down the middle of George Street saying we're going to love each other in the future. That doesn't end the revolving door and destabilisation. In opposition, I fear for Labor it can get worse unless they embrace. Are they part of the conspiracy, the Hare Krishna?
Probably.
Okay,
that's probably on them. You'd be right.
I can imagine Mark in the yellow.
But you've got to make the structural reforms inside the Labor Party to make it a credible force again, because just saying we love each other now is insufficient.
Okay, you want a brief comment?
Yeah. Why the endless fascination with the machinations rather than the direction that the party should be going?
Because the sub-factions are the party.
Because they're connected.
They are the party. All your issues about policy come down to the fact the sub-factions own the party.
Yes, well,
and unless you resolve the problem of the chaotic, unstable system that they've created, then you can't really move on to the policy issue. Labor's got to embrace an attitude of fixing up its organisational structure for the next 18 months and then move on to policy and presentation issues. Because at the moment they are a lower order concern.
I think it's a long... if this endlessly goes on without addressing policy, what's the use of having a Labor Party? You were the last politician that actually was gutsy enough to say the private schools were getting far too much money and the education system should be equalised, and you were crucified for it. It wasn't the handshake that did you in. It was attacking the private schools. Justly, I think. Absolutely justly.
Okay, it's time to move along. You're watching Q&A. The next question comes from Brian Davies.
My question's for Larissa. Campbell Newman's encouraging Tony Abbott to cut green tape and allow mining near the Barrier Reef and allow the expansion of the coal terminal at Abbott Point. A recent piece in The Guardian said that Tony Abbott's environment policies are the difference between coal and coral. Do you think Australians have just voted our coral reefs out of existence?
Excellent question, Brian, and I certainly hope not. You're right, what we've seen in Queensland under the Newman premiership has been almost all of our environmental protections completely ripped up, either repealed or just watered down beyond recognition. And yet, to my great disappointment, Tony Abbott's plan is to remove the federal government out of the environmental decision-making space when it comes to development approvals and to give complete control to people like Campbell Newman and Barry O'Farrell and the rest of the lot of them, so the federal government wouldn't be able to step in and protect the reef, for example. If you think of the Franklin Dam back in the 80s when the feds first stepped in and exerted some environmental muscle, that couldn't happen under Tony Abbott's proposal. The Franklin would be dammed. There'd be oil rigs in the Great Barrier Reef. There'd be cows in the Alpine National Park. This is exactly why we need the national government to have oversight of our national environment, because the states, frankly, are trashing the joint. And I fear for the future of the reef. We've had the World Heritage Committee already say that it could go on the in-danger list if we keep going down this path. And Abbott Point, of which I'm sure Clive is very keen for it to proceed so that some of his mines in the Galilee can export their thermal coal to make the world's climate worse and to make it harder for those coral reefs. If that goes ahead, that will be the gateway. That will be the downfall of the reef. From climate and also from all of the dredging and the dumping and the shipping. So,
all right, you've raised issues about Clive Palmer's interest in the Galilee Basin. I mean, is this the first time you think Campbell Newman's got something right?
Well, first of all, we don't want to compromise our environmental standards, but we don't want to take 5 or 6 years to make a decision. So we need to have high environmental standards, and we need to have a decision-making within a 12 or an 18 months period. What's wrong at the moment, we've got 3 levels of government in Australia: local, state and federal, and you can be waiting 6, 7 years to know that your project can't go ahead. Now, you know, whether it can go ahead or not go ahead, a developer needs to know that because it's costing him money in the process. And we can have strict requirements, we can have efficient, it's hard to believe, public servants, and we can have it open for scrutiny, right? And in this area it is anyway. But we don't want to have endless debates about something. If something shouldn't happen, the government could say, no, you can't do it, or yes, you can.
But do you agree with Campbell Newman that, in effect, he's asking Tony Abbott effectively to take the federal government out of the equation and leave it up to the state government?
Well, I think there needs to be a one authority that's got high standards that can act quickly and efficiently.
Do you
That's what I
think
think.
Campbell Newman has got high standards?
Well,
Can you seriously look at his
Campbell
record
Newman's
and say that?
former military officer, you know that, don't you?
Oh, no.
But before you get yourself into more hot water, I'm just going to go to a video question from Michelle Burke in Balaclava, Victoria.
Clive, Michelle here from Victoria. The Parliament Members' Code of Conduct states all members must act in the public interest first so that conflicts of interest don't occur. You are one of only 18 people in Australia who are billionaires, much of it off the back of the mining company you own, Mineralogy. The ABC poll of over 1 million Australians showed 59% believed the mining industry should pay more tax and only 10% believed it should pay less tax. But you have publicly stated your support for the Liberal plan to scrap the tax. So what steps are you really taking to ensure you have no conflict of interest and that you're doing everything you can to represent the concerns of the Australian people?
Well, firstly, I've been a company director for 40 years. As being a company director under the Corporations Law, there's a requirement, if you have a conflict of interest as a board meeting, you have to leave the room and abstain from voting. There's no such requirement in federal parliament. There needs to be in cabinet so people can do that. We don't want to deny people who have an interest in anything participating in our democracy, but we need to have high standards in the government and the cabinet. That doesn't apply under a Labor or Liberal government.
But you're not in Cabinet,
No,
Clive.
I'm answering.
There are rules in Cabinet, there's just not on the backbench.
No, there's not rules in the same level there is in the corporation law, and there should be. But, you know, just because I'm a member of a minority group in this country, it doesn't mean I can't have a say as an Australian citizen.
You mean, by which you mean billionaires?
Billionaires, that's right.
You're so oppressed, Clive, so oppressed.
Okay,
I'm discriminated against.
Clive, I'm just going to... I'm just going to press you on this. Are you going to fully disclose all your assets? Are you going to put all that out there if you become a member of Parliament? And will you take your senators out of votes on critical issues like the future of Abbott Point and so on?
Well, I can't give you all the news in one night, Tony. You won't invite me back, you know. Certainly it'll be a big story if I get elected to Parliament and I've got to disclose my interests, won't it? You can run a whole late line on that if you want to. I don't want to spoil that.
But briefly, does that mean you haven't decided what to do?
Well, look, you know, I'm an Australian and I just wanted to stand for Parliament because my family's had a strong commitment to the country. I lost my great uncle in World War I. 5 of us served in World War II. My nephew, Squadron Leader Martin Brewster, served in Indefending Timor. Why shouldn't I be allowed to stand for Parliament or express my opinion?
I know, they're in the military. I heard that.
Why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I?
No, it's not a question of whether you should be... It's a very simple question, really. It's about full disclosure of your assets and so on if you're in Parliament voting on issues.
Well, what have I got to hide? Nothing.
Hang on, you've questioned the constitutionality of the pecuniary interest register, haven't you?
No.
Well, you have in an interview.
Well, I may have. But
Maybe he was misrepresented, like his Tasmanian senator.
I haven't questioned it like illegally or challenged it or anything like that, Dink. But, you know, the whole point about it is it's not about what you've got, it's about what you can, how you can serve the community and what you can do in the future.
Okay.
The focus is always negative. It needs to be positive. We've got to create more wealth, get more demand, or our economy's stuffed.
Do you accept, if you get into Parliament, the register of interest is actually constitutional?
Yeah.
You didn't before. It's the vibe.
It's a standing order. It's a standing order of the House of Representatives. That's what it is.
All right, let's move on. We've got a few other things to get through. Our next question is from Jacqueline Elaine.
Hi, my question's for David to take him back to ideology and politics. When you wrote Don's Party about the Whitlam's era, politics seemed so fervently ideological compared to today's era where it all seems to be about self-interest, particularly in the media. Now you've written Rupert and you've been described as calling him ideologically fervent. Do you think Murdoch and the media more generally have contributed to or are just reflecting the lack of ideology in today's media coverage of politics?
Oh, there's huge ideology in the Murdoch's coverage of of anything. I mean, he is an extraordinary man. That's why I wrote the play about him. I wrote a play about Rupert's Cabaret. He invites you into the audience and tells you why he's one of the world's greatest men, and you've got to decide whether you believe it or not. But yeah, look, he is heavily ideological. He believes in that absolutist free market, which is a vast oversimplification of the world as it really is. And yes, he did influence the election. The proof of that, or it's enough for me, was that people in non-English speaking households, their vote didn't swing nearly as much as people in English speaking households who were reading the Daily Telegraph. Obviously, the non-English speaking ones weren't. That's not exactly conclusive proof, but you can't tell me that extraordinarily biased and vindictive and humiliating coverage of the Labor Party didn't have an effect. Of course it did. Rupert learnt the lessons in England long ago. If you want to destroy a political opponent, you ridicule them. And there they were in their Nazi hats and all of that sort of thing. It was, I do feel strongly that we are less than a functioning democracy when so much of the comment is controlled by one man who isn't an Australian citizen.
David, his ideology has shifted from time to time, obviously. He supported Whitlam into power. He supported Tony Blair into power in Britain. I think he even supported Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, only when
in
Tony Blair shifted his position to New Labor, which is old Thatcherism. I mean, then he got the nod. No, Rupert has enormous influence. I find him fascinating as a character. I'm far less judgmental of him on stage than I'm being now, because I think the audience shouldn't go and see someone beaten around the head by a lefty playwright. He tells his own story. So what I'm saying now is my real feelings, and I think it's. Well, I read about him because it is absolutely extraordinary that he's Richard III. He starts as a little failing newspaper proprietor in Adelaide and...
Donnock, Adelaide.
Up he goes. But he's even more extraordinary than Richard III because Richard III got his comeuppance in Bosworth Field and Rupert goes on forever. He's shrugged off the Leveson inquiry, he's shrugged off the tapes that exposed him saying the cops were idiots, and his share price still keeps rising.
I might add the Channel 9 version of him is not Richard III at all, but the rather romantic figure who seems to use his power for good as well as for bad.
Oh yes. I might have missed that point in the play, but no. Look,
let's hear from the others about Rupert Murdoch, and we'll start with Nick Xenophon.
Well, the Adelaide Advertiser, I think it's fair to say, has not been like the Daily Telegraph. I think that the editor there and their team was pretty fair to both sides, to all sides in the political debate. So I think that's a particularly Sydney phenomenon. But
Brisbane too, the Advertiser.
And the Courier Mail.
The Courier Mail was,
I mean, Rupert is, I think, our most remarkable Australian. Whether you love him or loathe him, he started with one newspaper, or two newspapers, one in Broken Hill, one in Adelaide, and built a worldwide empire. I think it raises issues about competition law and about diversity in media, and I hope that online media will actually break up that monopoly or that level of power, and that's where I see the hope is in terms of media diversity.
Rebecca, what feedback are you getting from talking to the Australian public? I mean, do you feel that David is right, that the Murdoch press fundamentally influenced the course of the election?
I don't think it's as straightforward. I would never say that they don't influence people's views, and we really saw its impact to really influence people's views in terms of the BER, in terms of the surplus, particularly around building schools. And what was remarkable about that is when we would conduct our discussion groups, people would say, oh, this BER, it's absolutely terrible. Oh, we love what they did at our school, isn't it terrific? And, you know, money should be spent on infrastructure to stimulate the economy, but isn't it terrible what they did with the BER? And that's because the Australian and others of the Murdoch press just pounded the BER day in, day out. So that they have been able to kind of frame the public debate on that issue. Interestingly, during the election, though, there was real pushback at the kind of very heavy-handed throw these guys out. And that was primarily because people were saying, we don't need you to tell us what we're already going to do. And so there is a bit more pushback, but it's perhaps not enough. And it's perhaps not in proportion to the influence that they have.
Yes, the demonisation of the BER, the final wash-up is that it was probably 5% overcharging, which for the money spent in that time and the benefit it gave to Australia was huge.
A commercial construction company would be
Clive
thrilled.
Palmer, let's hear Clive Palmer on the Rupert Murdoch question.
Well, first of all, Rupert Murdoch is a person who's sworn an oath of allegiance to a foreign country. He sent out here another alien from a foreign country. to sack the editor of the Courier Mail, to dismiss 40 journalists in News Corporation, and it said, if you don't do what I tell you, if you don't write what I tell you as an American citizen, you'll be dismissed. That's why he did it. And then Kevin Rudd thought this was so bad that he brought over Obama's media team to have a war with him, and every day Rupert gave instructions on Skype on what Australians will think and what Australians will do. Forget about me and politics. Think about your country. This is Australia. We don't need foreigners to tell us how to think and live.
And when Get Up does a very funny campaign with the paper and the dog poo, Murdoch's influence is so great that none of the other channels will run it.
It's just about power and influence of foreign citizens in this country. Yeah, we're Australians.
I take it from that, Clive, that you're not about to mend fences with Rupert Murdoch.
No, look, I don't really care about Murdoch. He doesn't live in Australia. He doesn't care about Australia. His citizenship's with another country. He's made his decision. But why should he participate in a domestic debate how Australians should vote? That's all it boils down to, really.
OK. I think we've got time for one quick last question. This one comes from Peter Ratch.
Thanks, Tony. There are now 2 people in high office in the world sleeping on single beds in a simple room. The Jesuit Pope Francis and Tony Abbott, Jesuit educated.
He was a Jesuit too.
What other Jesuit values can we expect from our new Prime Minister?
Let's start with Mark Latham.
Oh, well. not of that faith. I can't make the definitive judgment, but I think the interesting thing about Abbott is that the caricature of the left, trying to demonise him as a little Thatcherite, is inaccurate. Abbott essentially is a disciple of B.A. Santa Maria, and as such has a cynicism about open free markets that's reflected in many of his economic positions over the years. He, for instance, likes to parade himself as one of only 2 cabinet ministers who opposed work choices in the Howard government. So he's not an open free market tier, and his economic policies are not as pure as us economic rationalists would like. But at the other extreme, he certainly has, here I refer to probably his most instructive speech, the speech he gave in front of Rupert Murdoch at the IPA Jamboree in Melbourne, where he was holding up Christianity and conservative politics as the great protectors of Western values. He's worried about the Greens and lefties in general for rolling back the integrity of Western values, and we see, of course, his attachment to monarchy and traditional marriage as a reflection of this approach. So Abbott, in some respects, is a Santa Mariaite who is really worried about 2 extremes: the left rolling back Western values, the right rolling back government intervention in the market. So he's a much more complex figure than his barrackers, the ideologues from the right, would have it, and so too the attempt to portray him from a left position as some sort of cost-cutting machine. So he's much more complex and needs to be understood in that light.
All right, we'll just hear briefly, if we're almost out of time, Nick Xenophon, your thoughts?
Oh, I think Labor underestimated Tony Abbott, and I think we all have, and I think he'll be more pragmatic than you take him to. And to quote B.A. Santa Maria, that's the way it is.
That's the way it is, yeah.
Rebecca Huntley.
When I read that he was going to sleep in this kind of single-person bed, I thought that's very clever, because if he is going to start to cut services, and if he's going to start to talk about any kind of austerity, he needs to not be accused of living in a $3,000 apartment. So I saw it as a political stunt, but a very effective one.
Look, I don't think he's an enormously impressive political figure or an enormously impressive leader. I think the public voted against the Labor Party rather than for Tony. Because they were faced with absolute leadership, viciousness, chaos. They were never going to win.
Larissa?
Well, look, I think the decision to spend his time in a rather stark, unfurnished apartment will hopefully bring into sharp focus for him the plight of the single parents that he unfortunately wants to take even more support from. In terms of the other values that we should see from him as a Jesuit, Well, sadly, we're not seeing compassion for refugees. We're not seeing thinking about future generations by acting on climate change, and we're not seeing giving everyone a fair go by making sure the big miners pay their fair share. So I despair, unfortunately. I'm an optimist by nature, but I am very worried about what we'll see. And just the shape of his front bench indicates his position on women. I found it really offensive that he was parading his daughters around in the campaign, and yet we've got 5% females on the front bench.
OK, Clive Palmer, we'll end with you, and I must ask you this. If you do go to Canberra, will you take a room in the YMCA?
No, definitely not. But let me say, Tony Abbott, I would say, is a middle-class Catholic person who has traditional values, right? And as such, he's not a mad market person, etc. But I think he's in the middle of the road, and I think he is a caring person, really. And I think he offers a lot of forgiveness to people that are offending. I know I offend him every day, right? But I also think he needs to widen his experience and go out of a narrow function. I'm sure he'll do that as Prime Minister, because we live in a bigger country. We've got a diverse population of views and people, and the Prime Minister, whoever he is, need to serve those people.
Do you think you'll be able to work with him?
Well, I hope so.
For a common end?
Well, I mean, I'm not even a member of Parliament. I've got little influence in this whole thing.
Well, you could have 2 senators, just to start with.
Well, but that's up to them, isn't it? I just have to listen to them and hope they've got the right way of going.
That's all we have time for tonight on that rather disingenuous note. Please thank our panel, Mark Latham, Larissa Waters, Clive Palmer, David Williamson, Rebecca Huntley and Nick Xenophon. Thank you. And next Monday, a special Polly-free Q&A with renowned environmentalist, scientist and campaigner David Suzuki. He's visiting Australia to deliver the Jack Beale Lecture, Imagining a Sustainable Future. It's familiar territory for Professor Suzuki, who's campaigned for a sustainable environment for decades. But on next week's Q&A, we'll bring together an audience of students, scientists, advocates and citizens, which includes critics as well as supporters, so that David Suzuki can answer your questions and defend his sometimes controversial views. That's Q&A with David Suzuki next Monday night at 9:35. Until then, good night.